Well, hello everybody. Welcome into Great Atmosphere here on this Monday, February 26th of 2024, coming down to the very end of our meteorological winter days. And as such, we are already starting to see our transitions into more springtime weather patterns, particularly this week in the midweek regarding a severe setup that we discussed at length last week. Certainly coming to fruition to a degree. It certainly looked a little bit more quote-unquote scary due to what the ensembles were saying last week. Things have calmed down just a little bit, maybe shifted a little bit further to the north, but we'll get into that in just a bit. First, taking a look at our true color CONUS imagery from the GOES satellite. Generally speaking, we have cloudy conditions up in the Pacific Northwest as our primary troublemaker starts to make its way off of the off the Pacific Ocean and into the contiguous U.S. and North American mainland as it is. That is a general representation of our polar jet that is starting to dip down into the States, but we also have our subtropical jet, which has slowly been both shifting back and forth based off where the North Pacific jet currently is. Right now it's shifting back into its southwesterly flow pattern and going over the southwestern states as a whole. And then we see a little bit of overrunning in the upper levels from that jet over Texas and the central south, and then a low-level response, generally speaking, over the southeast U.S. with lots of warm, moist air being advected in by a big high-pressure system sitting off of the mid-Atlantic or the southeastern coastline. And a little bit of pop-up Q that popped up today as that warm air advection really started to get going, got a little isentropic lift going on into the Appalachians and interactions with cold air aloft. You get a little pop-up showers over the Virginia Piedmont today. Generally speaking, very nice and mild, very mild conditions over the Midwest and the northeastern states for the majority of this Monday. Taking a look at the upper-level water vapor imagery, you can get a better understanding of the upper-level response in terms of where these jet streams are and how they are currently in motion. We see our primary polar jet making its way in like so, and then our subtropical going in like this. And the main storyline going into Tuesday, Wednesday will be what the interaction between these two jets ultimately means, because essentially it's sandwiching a lot of the mid-latitudinal air in between these areas. So you would say areas that are south of the subtropical jet would be considered tropical, and then areas north of the polar jet would be considered Arctic air. So really, you only have this area right here separating very warm, tropical-esque air from cold, dry, polar or Arctic air, and then the mid-latitudinal air has to get squeezed in the middle. And that squeeze is ultimately what provides the very, very strong synoptically led forcing that's going to ultimately create a bit of a severe problem over the Midwestern states as we go into Tuesday and into Wednesday. Taking a look at what that jet level response is going to be, we can take a look first at what that looks like in the 300 millibar level of the atmosphere. We'll take it back to what this is the Euro high-res model. Going into today, you can see that subtropical jet making its way across the southern tier of the U.S. with the polar jet starting to make its way down. We'll go further and further until that first little trough starts to get into Nebraska, Kansas. So in this particular region, this is ultimately what the models did not pick up on last week. So last week, it was generally coming to a consensus among most of the flagship models. Apologies for pivotal. A little bit too far. There we go. Mainly among the flagship models, they were having this primary, what they call as a jet phase, where the two primary jets start to interact with one another and influence one another in what they do. The phase was coming a little bit earlier on, and what that would have done would have created a much more of a negative tilt with the trough, with the polar jet trough as well, and slowed the system down so it would become more of a multi-day event. That is not the case. It seems pretty much, actually, we have quite a bit of model consensus across pretty much everyone that is not going to be the case. They will phase, generally speaking, over the Midwest, so you can see that DPVA, or the diffluent positive vorticity advection, or divergent, all the way across in this general region with those isobars that are spreading out. That is always in any kind of jet, whether they be isolated or not, or phased together or not. Anytime that you see diverging flow like that in the upper levels of the atmosphere is divergence aloft, which means that there's convergence at the surface. And of course, if there's converging air at the surface, the air can only go up, which is where you would get your necessary convective elements in order to be able to create strong thunderstorms. And whenever you have two major synoptic jets influencing one another and more or less provoking one another into actually into essentially it's a little bit of a multiplicative power surge that it kind of gets all the way through every layer of the atmosphere. It kind of helps to force even more air up much quicker, and thus much more convection is adequately available, which in these circumstances we would generally expect a little bit more of a severe hail threat as well, just because those updrafts are much stronger based off of the two jets coming together and diverging on the outset of their exit regions. So in this particular situation, though, instead of the jet max, so if this is the primary trough right here, instead of the jet maxes being on either end, where you would see this yellow region kind of like split in between two, and then a not as in between region, I would say, in the primary apex of the trough. Instead, we have the opposite, where the jet max is actually in the middle, right there. So what essentially that means is that it's done. It's reached at this level. It has reached maturity already, and it is going to, whatever surface low that it generates in its lee right here is already going to start to spin up and occlude, and then it's going to rocket up into the northeastern latitudes. So it wouldn't come down a lot further south. So in this particular scenario that we have cooking up for Tuesday, we were thinking it would be more of a Mississippi River Valley event. And there still could be generally speaking, a good QLCS squall to form in the outset of the cold front that comes through. But as far as like convectively operated discrete supercells that we would otherwise generally be expecting in the warm sector, we are not expecting to see that out of this particular system, due to where that jet streak maximum ultimately began in this particular model setup. So we can see as we go forward in time, we can see that it generally starts to move up into the northeast in the upper levels, and by this time it should be starting to weaken quite considerably. Any type of severe convective element is going to fizzle out by the time that it hits the Appalachian Mountains. You could make an argument that Ohio and maybe Western PA would be under the gun for some residual effects from that convection, but ultimately we would not. I don't think I would anticipate as much of a severe response from that. And then we can actually see quite clearly our next succeeding systems, a little bit of a shortwave forms in the Four Corners region, forming into a panhandle low. That will ultimately open up a low-level jet response over the southeast, creating a little bit more of a wet work week than we were otherwise expecting, particularly in the latter portions of the week and Thursday into Friday for the southeast. But as we go forward, you see that shortwave trough start to merge back into the overall polar jet response, and then we go into our next system, which would begin, let's see here, looks like the beginning of the work week next, where it's a much more of a different setup here. This is according to the Euro, and this is definitely something that I think is quite interesting in this particular setup, just because we see that the jet maximum, we have a already established negatively tilted trough, and the jet max is well down. The primary trough and the surface low is already over the Four Corner states, and the jet maximum is on the west end of the trough here in the northern hemisphere, which is you could, depending on what this subtropical phasing does, if the subtropical jet starts to make more of a response like this, and then we have our polar jet response like this, that could open up the southeast or the central plains and the Mississippi River Valley quite considerably, and it is going to slow down a little bit too, considering the placement of that jet maximum according to where the Euro is placing it in this particular guidance here at the 12Z Monday run. This generally speaking, I would say would slow this down, so it would become a multi-day event, and we can probably see that play out here. So if if we see the primary diffluence aloft start to begin Sunday 18Z, so Sunday afternoon, we can go all the way out here. Are we still seeing a response? And okay, that's interesting too. So we get a cutoff low that forms over the Dakotas. That generally, whenever you get a cutoff low, and if this cutoff, apologies, let's go back to where the cutoff begins. So whenever we have a cutoff low, there is a risk that the polar jet starts to go above it. And when that occurs, this can just start to spin and spin and spin on top of one another. And if there's a if there's high pressure anywhere around in the Caribbean or the Atlantic, it's just going to open up the Gulf, and that's where you actually get it's where you get flooding rains, and you get multi-day severe convection. I don't know if that's generally speaking what's going to happen here, because I think the polar jet's going to reabsorb this. But that is a risk with cutoff lows, just having it sit over the top. And it looks like it's going to get synoptically pushed out by a little bit of a Rex block pattern that comes in high over low over the Rocky Mountains area, and then the subtropical jet is the kicker. So wouldn't expect a huge response there, but it's definitely slower. Like, we can see that the ultimate trough that we were dealing with on Sunday is still present in the northern regions of the U.S. by Wednesday or late Tuesday night. So certainly a much more, I wouldn't say virulent or severe threat, but certainly a more long-lived threat going into the early part of the next work week. So you already got 3 systems already right there lined up for you, and they're all going to be exhibiting different factors that will have effects and impacts in the coming days. SBC, looking at their current graphics, we have slight risk extending in all the way down into the St. Louis, Missouri area, all the way into the Detroit region, southern regions of Michigan, Chicago, Indianapolis, looks like Toledo, Ohio. Those are the regions that we would kind of expect to see the highest chance of a slight risk. All hazards index. Tornado risk is at a 5%, primarily over those northern reaches of Illinois and Indiana. High wind, I think this is going to be probably the main factor for the majority of people throughout the coast, throughout the eastern seaboard wind, as that major cold front comes through. Remember, we are merging tropical air against Arctic air. Anytime that you have temperatures that are that divergent, interacting with one another, that just ultimately equates to a higher wind probability out ahead of the frontal boundary. And then, as expected, we got a 15% hatched region over those same areas and this is for hail. So probability of 1-inch diameter hail or larger within 20 miles of any point, 10% or greater probability of 2-inch diameter hail or larger within 25 miles of any hatched area. So that is primarily due to that jet phasing in between them. You have very elevated levels of convection and updrafts with some very strong winds associated with them within those columns. So definitely something to keep an eye on for those particular regions right there. Definitely a hail and wind threat. Can't rule out a tornado by any means due to the levels of wind shear we would expect to see in that particular region out ahead of the warm front after we've had maximal radiational heating for the day on Tuesday. But ultimately, that is those are the primary factors that we're going to be looking at. Taking a look at the all hazards index for the day, and this is reflective of what I was expecting here in terms of wind. So we have a lot of red flag warnings or fire weather warnings all throughout the Central Plains and the Mountain West, and high wind warnings up into the upper elevations, if not winter storm warnings, as those upper level precipitation factors and just upper level moisture in general starts to make its way down and across the Rocky Mountains and up and against the westward facing slopes of the Cascadian Range. But primarily the 2 major factors in this are high winds, which comes with the territory of a very strong transitional season cold front. And then you also have the fact that the area is primarily experiencing a little bit of a drought. For the most part, this general sector, the Northeast and the North Central Plains, have been largely rain-free. I don't want to say completely rain-free, but certainly anomalously rain-free since the beginning of the month, and certainly so across New Mexico and West Texas, and that's why we're seeing red flag warnings extend all the way out. And some of these are in anticipation of the front that's going to be making its way through. We would expect the winds, since they are going to be are scheduled to be so strong with this particular system ahead of the cold front. They're going to be straight line, and they're going to extend out quite a bit from the actual precipitation itself, just due to that disparity in temperature. So definitely keep an eye out if you're in those particular areas, or you know anybody in that area. And we could take a look a little bit more actually at what the expected wind gusts are supposed to be out of the system. Now, this is not saying this is going to be sustained winds. This is essentially a map that explains what the highest recorded expected wind gust will be in that area through the entire period. So once it hits one particular high parameter, that's where the map will stay in that region. And as we go forward all the way into, let's take this all the way to the end of the system on Wednesday, overnight, Tuesday, Wednesday, you can see that everywhere essentially that isn't on the Gulf Coast is up for potentially a high 30, low 40 mile an hour wind gust. Upper elevations, you'd expect even higher, up into the 50s and 60 mile an hour wind gusts, which of course is close to tropical storm strength, so, or I should say hurricane strength. So definitely something to keep an eye on with those straight line winds, and that'll be a major factor in and around, I would say, in the Indiana, Ohio, and southern Illinois regions for the most part. Interesting little pocket of disturbances here in the North Carolina Piedmont. I assume those would be convectively initiated and are just an end result of the front moving through. And we can actually see what that front moving through looks like in a very pretty easy spot the cold front kind of setup here. As we go forward, this would be noon on Tuesday. We have winds that have been just screaming out of the south and into the Gulf, creating this big warm sector all the way up and into Michigan and Wisconsin and the greater portions of the Midwest. That ultimate interaction is what's going to spark off a lot of this convective initiation. So we see that cold air just start to channel in. Kind of a dual surface low setup that I'm kind of seeing here at the early onset of it. Let's see. So you can see a little bit of turning. You see a little bit of a response right here, and then you have another here, and that is a very common setup when you have phasing jets. So you will have the parent low that'll start to form at the surface. Once they begin to phase, that'll start to initiate and bring in even more warm air up and into the UP and Lake Superior, and on the outset begin to go down here, and it'll interact with an already a shortwave trough perturbation that's going to be sitting over the Four Corners. That moves off and becomes a panhandle low, and then that itself will work to create even much more of a warm frontal response, bringing even more air, and then any of the residual cold air that the surface at the northern latitude surface low starts to bring in is then reinforced on the back end with this low before they both begin to start merging as a whole and start to move up and away, as is typical with an occluding system. So that's what we would expect out of this, and you can see that come to fruition here as we go forward in time. Really pretty map. You can just see it sort of make its way all the way down in, and to see the disparity in the temperatures, particularly in the middle of the day here on Tuesday. Let's go. Like, look at this. You get central Missouri. You're sitting at, probably mid 80s, and then you go across the border and go to Kansas City, and you're in the 40s, if not worse. So it's quite the disparity. About 40-ish, maybe even 50-degree temperature drop across the plains. And of course, the plains doesn't have a lot of trees or topography for anything to interfere with those winds. Could be some pretty significant straight line events that we get out of this. It'll be interesting to see the local storm reports after this. We can take a look at what the NAM 3 kilometers radar reflectivity is looking like. We can see some discrete cells pop up out ahead of it. I don't expect that to be, there's not a lot of instability out ahead of this, mainly because the moisture response is generally going up and into the central plains in the Midwest. It's not really going up into the Northeast or the Southeast all that much. So I think this is just residual, and you can see as we start, the low will start to heat up, and that right along that warm frontal boundary going into the evening and unfortunately overnight hours on Tuesday into Wednesday is when we start to really kick in this convective response. It starts to move up and into Michigan, and then we can see on the back end where the final form of the storm will be as the cold front starts to make its way here, begins to form overnight, and then it starts to be our primary initiator for convection as we go forward for the majority of the rest of the eastern seaboard. And then we should, as far as timing is concerned, it hits us in the southeast about midday on Wednesday, if not later into the evening. And the overall severity of that will obviously vary by region, but the instability as a whole, as I said, I mean, due to a low-level moisture response, I wouldn't expect it to be anything more than a very gusty storm for the southeast, based off the model guidance for today. And we could take a look at the agreement that actually has been across this system in terms of where the majority of that forcing will be. This would be Wednesday at 6Z, so this is about midnight on Tuesday night. We can move forward a little bit further just to see maybe a little bit more of a disparity potentially, but we can look at it. The euro is a little bit more, has a little bit more strength in the jet response. GFS has definitely been the most bullish. That's nothing entirely surprising out of the GFS. It is predicting a much harsher phasing between the two, and thus probably more of a easterly component in terms of the severe threat. GFS certainly wants to push it more into Ohio and Pennsylvania. HER is kind of the same. Now HER is interesting. HER has been generally very accurate as far as cams go. So far, it predicted pretty much the last three major trough pattern systems quite accurately compared to the flagships. So I definitely give the HER a little bit more credit. It'll be interesting to see. Now it has a very similar response to the GFS, which is concerning. But in terms of other synoptically based descents and whatnot that are in the area, I just don't necessarily see so much. I mean, it's early, right? So I mean, like we'll see what, and the cams go out about 60 hours. So this is kind of the end of what the HER and the NAM3K are going to be predicting here. Not necessarily the best agreement there, but in terms of the icon and the euro, they're in lockstep. The NAM is in lockstep. RAP is a little bit more on the HER side of things. So interesting little response there. And then let's take a look at precip totals out of this. Precips this is at the end of the entire event. Actually, this is way out ahead. I need to go back. So through everything, including our system that we expect to see at the beginning of the week on Monday, the euro is saying primarily a generally mid-Atlantic to southeastern storm system. It doesn't look like it looks like the euro wants to put a lot of the initial convection to fall in that northern Indiana region, so Illinois might be left out, particularly in the western regions, which is not that entirely great, particularly considering they are in that drought region. But a big response for the southeast as a whole, extending from New Orleans all the way and up and into New England. So certainly an interesting little setup for sure. We can take a look at what those two flagship models are looking at and just kind of see what those model agreements look like. Let's let it load just a little bit. So excuse me. Okay. So we see those model responses come in for the GFS and the euro. And remember, euro is generally going to be more accurate in most cases. Now, here's another caveat regarding transitional seasons in the flagship models. The flagship models are bad in general at forecasting convection, and they are much better at forecasting things on a synoptic scale. As we go into the warmer months, and particularly transitional seasonal periods, it gets worse and worse and worse in terms of being able to predict those things, because convective models like HER, NAM, RAP, those kind of model guidances, they're made to be convective. They're convective allowing. They're not cloud limited by like the euro and the GFS is. So as we go forward into more of our severe weather season, I definitely will be more reliant on those convectively allowing models, even though they only go out to about 60 hours in the future. And we're going to be using the euro and the GFS mainly to just get an idea of where our problem areas are, and then kind of adjust accordingly. I'm not going to pay attention to like the severity indices that are associated with both of them, because they generally do a poor job. I'm just going to kind of see where their overall trough locations are, and where their mean low pressure centers are located, and then kind of go from there in terms of it. So it's all just to kind of get an understanding of timing, and then by comparing, if you use the euro as your primary source and then use the GFS as an opportunity to build confidence on your forecast, that's pretty much my thought process going into it. So we can see going into Wednesday, this is on noon on Wednesday. This is when the majority of the severe response is going to be about midnight on Wednesday. So we see that initiating over the Midwestern states and into southern Michigan. Interesting, because there is so much cold air on the back end of this, there is a significant chance of a good amount of lake effect snow to come out of this as well on the back end, in addition to any of the westward facing slopes in the Allegheny and the Appalachians, as far down south as Mount Mitchell up in North Carolina, about 5,000 feet above sea level. So really interesting kind of response there. We see high pressure start to build in on the back end. That's going to flush out and kind of definitely dry out our Thursday for a good bit before that high pressure moves out very quickly. Actually, by Friday it's already off the coast and it's starting to open up the Gulf yet again. It kind of merges with that short wave that we talked about earlier that becomes a panhandle low, opens up the Gulf, and then the severity of this I don't anticipate to be. I'm not bullish on that. I think it's going to be more of a very miserable cold rain. Once again, because we're going to get very warm. It's very preceding this cold front coming through. I mean, like 50s or 70s and 80s across majority of the southeast, and then once we get out here, you can see behind it we're back in the 40s and 50s. So any rain that comes immediately after that is going to be cold and miserable, and certainly not wintry by any means, but it's certainly not going to be enjoyable either. And then we'll get out to our next system, which will be, I'd say, a little bit, it's definitely more interesting in terms of timing, just because I think it has more potential to create a much more widespread severe response based off its negative tilt and wanting to kind of move a little bit slower and more throughout the contiguous U.S. region before starting to occlude and shoot up into the north and weaken. So that's definitely going to be what I'm going to be taking a look at, and you can see that kind of already making its way into the models. Not saying this is going to be the tried and true anything. This is still over, this is at 198 hours out for both of these. But this is just what we are expecting timing-wise as of right now in terms of keeping an eye on things. And then we'll take a last quick look at the GEFS Global Ensemble just to kind of see where we're looking at. This is looking out to mid-March. And, you know, we're kind of seeing some good signs as well that this pattern is going to kind of stay here for a little bit. We have anytime once we get southwest flow coming out, you know, that's generally speaking what we want. And we'll have ridging. Now, I would say that if we had this primary trough area to be a little bit more further and into the Rockies, that would open us up a whole lot more. But, you know, in terms of getting stuff in the southeast, this is actually a pretty good setup, I would say, for getting a severe little threat. If we had high pressure set up out here, which is what the ensemble is saying, you know, for the Atlantic coast, we would expect more high pressure centers. That is quite interesting, and if we force more polar air down and into the Mountain West, and importantly, the forcing of this is this polar jet response that stays. It seems like that's still going strong along the Aleutians. You know, according to the ensemble, at least through the beginning parts of March. That is a good sign that at least turbulence is certainly in the cards in terms of weather. Not unexciting series of events coming down our way so far. March is definitely looking like it'll be coming in like a lion. That will be also out. That will taking a look at the Climate Prediction Center's week 3 to 4 outlook. This goes out into March 9th through the 22nd, and we see that we have generally across the whole of the United States above average chances for precipitation throughout the course of the period. And then we can see that also we don't have that much of a risk for an increase in any like more polar air. I would say that the polar vortex is pretty solidly over Siberia and doesn't seem to be wanting to move. We'll see what the MJO does. There has been talk that the MJO will move back from a neutral state and into phases 3 and 4 beginning next week. That sometimes can be an indicator that the polar vortex is on the move, and we might be able to get some late season cold snaps, which I know is not what farmers want to hear, but it's just kind of what happens this time of year sometimes, and we'll definitely be taking a look at that down the line. But that is all I got for you today. Certainly some fun stuff coming down the pipe in terms of severe. It's just it's that time of year again. I'm glad to be a part of it. I'm glad that y'all tuned in for today. Once again, my name is Zach for Great Atmosphere, and I appreciate your subscription to the channel if you're so inclined. And I'll be doing these weather forecasts for you every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on the channel, primarily focused on the Southeast U.S. since I am based in Charlotte. But by all means, obviously, if big weather is coming our way or there's interesting weather throughout the course of the world, I'm not going to be shy to talk about that either. Well, once again, I appreciate you tuning in, and I'll see you folks on Wednesday for another video. Take care.